You're out hunting in the dense brush of Arizona, chasing a wild pig across a remote field in Yavapai County. The heat beats down, the dry earth crunches beneath your boots. Suddenly, you stumble, not over a rock, not over a root, but bones. Human bones. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. That's how this story begins. Not in a crime scene taped off in an alleyway. Not with a dramatic phone call to the police. But with a pig. A pig that accidentally exposed one of the most chilling, haunting, and baffling cases of human remains ever discovered in modern America. The body, decomposed down to skeletal fragments, was partially buried in shallow earth and partially scattered, possibly by animals or the elements. The remains were so deteriorated, so stripped of clues, that no one even knew whether the person was male or female. No name, no age, no clothing. Nothing but a handful of brittle bones and a mystery buried deep in the Arizona soil. The year was 1975. The Vietnam War had just ended. America was trying to move forward, but this person, whoever they were, had been left behind, discarded like a ghost with no name and no one to miss them. The local authorities did what they could. They recorded the case, logged the evidence, and filed the bones under a name that would become legendary in forensic circles, Munsingwear Doe, named after the label on a single remnant of underwear found nearby. That tiny scrap of cloth was the only personal clue that remained. No wallet, no ID, no dental records matched, no missing person reports from the area aligned. For decades, the file sat collecting dust, unsolved, unidentified, unclaimed. It would take 48 years, 2 generations, and a scientific revolution in forensic DNA technology before the world would finally learn the truth. That those bones, those forgotten fragments of a lost life, once belonged to Gerald Francis Long, a quiet, loyal, 22-year-old U.S. Army veteran who had vanished without a trace in the mid-1970s. A man who had served his country. A man who had a family. A man who for nearly 5 decades no one even knew was gone. So how did Gerald disappear? Why was he left in that field? Who took his life? And more importantly, why? And how did genetic genealogy finally crack this impossible case? This is the full, shocking, and long-awaited story of Gerald Francis Long, the Vietnam vet who disappeared, and whose bones waited nearly half a century to speak. To understand how a man can vanish so completely that even time forgets his name, we have to rewind the clock to a young man in uniform, standing quietly beside a plane, decades before his bones would be discovered by chance. Gerald Francis Long wasn't a criminal, a drifter, or someone trying to disappear. He was a son, a soldier, and according to those who knew him, a man of few words but deep convictions. Born in the early 1950s, Gerald was raised in a quiet neighborhood in New Jersey. The post-war years were tough, but hopeful. Families were healing. The country was rebuilding. Gerald was known for being a quiet observer, someone who soaked in the world around him, not someone who demanded to be noticed. When he joined the U.S. Army, it wasn't a surprise. Like many young men of his era, he saw it as his duty. Serving your country wasn't just something you did. It was who you were. By all accounts, Gerald served honorably. He trained, he traveled, and then he disappeared. Not from war, not from an active battlefield. Gerald was last seen alive sometime in the mid-1970s, not long after his service ended. There's no confirmed record of his movements after that. No known address, no phone number, no contact with family, and perhaps the most chilling part, no missing person report. No one reported Gerald Francis Long missing. Why? Some believe his family may have assumed he simply moved on with his life. Others suggest that post-service trauma, possibly PTSD, led him to isolate himself. In the 1970s, veterans didn't receive the mental health support they desperately needed. Many struggled in silence. Some vanished by choice. Others were lost by force. But there's another theory, one that haunts this story, like a shadow, that Gerald didn't disappear by choice, that he never meant to leave, that someone made sure he never returned. And while Gerald's family drifted through life believing he was out there somewhere, perhaps unreachable, his body was decaying quietly in the Arizona desert, a place he had no clear ties to. Why was he there? What led him, a man from New Jersey, to such a remote and lonely field in Yavapai County? We don't know yet, but what we do know is this. His body wasn't hidden well. It was buried shallowly, with no marker, almost as if someone didn't care whether he was found or not, or worse, didn't expect him to ever be discovered at all. The remains were stumbled upon in 1975 by farmers who weren't even looking for a body. They were tracking a pig. Yes, a pig that had broken free and run into the brush. It's disturbingly ironic. Gerald Long served his country with honor, yet it took a rogue pig to bring him back into the light of history. When the remains were first analyzed, the technology was too primitive to extract much. They could only say the bones likely belonged to a white male, but no clear age, no name, no match. For decades, Munsingwear Doe became just another cold case in Arizona's long archive of unidentified souls. But bones remember. And in 2023, 48 years after they were unearthed, science finally caught up with justice. Thanks to forensic genetic genealogy, the same groundbreaking technique that caught the Golden State Killer, a DNA profile was built, and this time, it hit. The bones belonged to Gerald Francis Long, and the moment his name was returned, the questions began. A name. After 48 years of silence, the bones finally had a name. But names don't close wounds. Names don't bring back the years lost in darkness. Sometimes, they only open new questions. When authorities confirmed the skeletal remains belonged to Gerald Francis Long, the discovery didn't bring immediate closure. It sparked confusion, shock, and for some, guilt, because in the nearly 5 decades since he vanished, no one had come forward. No one had reported him missing. His family, still alive, still living quietly across state lines, had no idea he died. They thought he had simply gone off-grid, choosing solitude over society. Some believed he wanted nothing to do with them anymore. That assumption haunted them once the truth came out. Gerald's niece, who had never met him in person, spoke in a soft, tearful interview after the news broke. "We didn't know he was gone. We thought he just needed space. Now I think he needed help." What makes this case so eerie is how invisible Gerald had become. After serving in the army, he returned briefly to civilian life. But something changed. Friends fell out of touch. Employment records stopped. No confirmed addresses. No active bank accounts. It was as if he simply slipped away, one step at a time, until no one was watching anymore. And someone took advantage of that. Remember, Gerald's body wasn't buried with care. He wasn't laid to rest. He was dumped, left in a shallow grave, half covered by the hard Arizona soil. If the remains hadn't been disturbed by a wild pig decades later, his body might never have been found. That alone tells investigators one crucial thing. This wasn't a peaceful death. The location was remote, isolated, hidden among mesquite, thorn brush, and bone-dry sand about 40 miles east of Flagstaff. Gerald had no known ties to Arizona. He wasn't stationed there, he didn't own property there, and yet, that's where he was found. So what was he doing there? 2 theories have taken root, both unsettling. The first is that Gerald had fallen into homelessness or transient living, possibly due to untreated PTSD. The 1970s were not kind to veterans. Many slipped through the cracks, hitchhiking across the country, sleeping rough, working odd jobs. It's possible Gerald crossed paths with the wrong person while simply trying to survive. But then there's the second theory, far darker, that Gerald was targeted. A quiet veteran, no paper trail, no missing persons report. To someone with violent intent, Gerald may have seemed like the perfect victim, a man no one was looking for, a man no one would miss, and the killer, if there was one, they succeeded. Gerald's death went unnoticed for 48 years. No headlines, no investigations, no leads, just bones, rotting in silence, until 2023. That's when Intermountain Forensics, A non-profit DNA lab used advanced techniques to build a genetic profile from Gerald's remains. They uploaded it to public genealogy databases, not to match to his own DNA record, which didn't exist, but to find living relatives. And that's exactly what happened. A distant cousin, then another. The tree narrowed, branches began to meet, and eventually, the team traced the identity back to one man who had vanished decades earlier without a trace. Gerald Francis Long. It was the kind of miracle moment that modern forensics can now deliver, taking forgotten remains and giving them a name, a history, a family. But for Gerald's loved ones, it wasn't just science, it was grief, rediscovered after so many years, forced to mourn a man they thought had chosen to walk away, only to learn he may have never had that choice. Sometimes bones can speak louder than words, and when Gerald's finally did, the silence they broke left more than just grief, it left questions that no one was ready to answer. After Intermountain Forensics confirmed the identity of the Munsingwear Doe, the revelation made national headlines. But the most chilling part wasn't who he was, it was how long he'd been waiting to be found, and what the remains revealed when the experts looked closer. For years, the assumption had been simple: unidentified male, death by exposure, possibly natural causes. But Gerald's remains had never been properly re-examined since the 1970s, until now. And what forensic anthropologists discovered raised alarms. The skeletal fragments, while degraded, held subtle but disturbing clues. Small fractures in the ribs, trauma to the skull consistent with blunt force, and most notably, a broken left radius bone, the kind of injury often caused by defensive action. An arm raised to protect the head, that changed everything. This wasn't just a forgotten man who died in the elements, this was potentially a homicide. And for nearly 50 years, it had gone unnoticed, uninvestigated, unsolved. The remains also showed signs of being hastily buried. A shallow grave partially dug by hand or makeshift tool, not machinery. No personal items were found near the body. No watch, no wallet, no jewelry. Just a scrap of undergarment, worn thin and torn. The very brand on that garment, Munsingwear, is what earned the case its nickname. But what most people don't realize is that label was what kept Gerald's story alive. That small faded word, stitched inside a waistband, became the only trace that connected a lifeless skeleton to something once human. For decades, that was all authorities had. But with modern forensic genealogy, everything changed. Public DNA databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, when used legally and ethically, have become revolutionary tools in solving cold cases. By building genetic profiles from old bones, scientists can reverse engineer family trees and find living relatives, even distant ones, who unknowingly hold the key to unlocking a stranger's identity. In Gerald's case, it was two third cousins in Minnesota who provided the genetic matches that unraveled the mystery. At first, they were skeptical. Who was this unidentified man? Why were police reaching out? But when the family photos were laid side by side, there was no denying it. The eyes, the jawline, the resemblance was haunting. Gerald's family, now scattered across the U.S., came forward with what little they knew. He had always been quiet, they said. Withdrawn. After returning from military service, he became distant. Calls stopped, letters faded. Eventually, they simply assumed he wanted a clean break. They were wrong. He hadn't broken ties. He'd been broken. By who? And why? No suspects have been named. No new evidence has come to light. But that hasn't stopped the speculation. Some believe Gerald may have been murdered by someone he trusted, a fellow veteran, perhaps. Others think he may have fallen victim to a serial predator operating in the West in the 1970s, an era where dozens of men were killed across deserts, highways, and rural counties with chilling similarity. One local theory, long whispered in Yavapai County, involves a series of unconfirmed killings along Highway 40, where drifters and hitchhikers were known to vanish. Gerald's body was found just miles from the old route. Could he have been one of many? What haunts people most is how preventable it all seems in hindsight. If someone had filed a missing person report, if someone had noticed he was gone, if the technology we have now existed back then, would Gerald have been found? Would justice have been served? Instead, he became a ghost, a case file, a nickname, Munsingwear Doe, until 2023. And now, his story is rewriting what we know about cold cases. It's igniting funding for more genetic testing. It's giving hope to families who thought they'd never have answers. And most of all, it's proving one haunting truth: even the forgotten can be found. They called him Munsingwear Doe. For 48 years, that was all he was. A name stitched on a scrap of underwear. A file in a cabinet. A mystery that nobody expected would ever be solved, until he became something else. A name. A face. A man. Gerald Francis Long. When Gerald was finally identified, it wasn't the end of a story, it was the start of a reckoning. For decades, no one looked for him. No search parties, no missing posters, no national headlines. Gerald Francis Long simply vanished into the cracks of time, like so many others who slipped through the gaps in a system that wasn't built to catch them. But his case has done more than put a name to bones. It has sparked action. In the months following his identification, cold case teams across the country began pulling out old files, the long-lost John and Jane Does who've waited silently, anonymously, sometimes for over half a century. These files aren't just evidence, they're people. People with families, with histories, with stories like Gerald's. And there are more out there. Hundreds. Thousands. They're waiting. In filing cabinets. In back rooms. In databases, in shallow graves scattered across the country. But now, with the rise of forensic genealogy, there's hope. Because Gerald's case proved something powerful: science can bring the lost home, even after 48 years. Even when no one is looking. Even when all that's left is a name sewn into cotton. Still, the mystery of how Gerald died remains unsolved. Was it a robbery gone wrong? A random act of violence? A predator who knew how to pick victims no one would miss? We may never know, but we do know this: Gerald Francis Long deserved more. He deserved a funeral, a family, a memory, a voice. And now, thanks to science and a pig who wandered into the brush one day in 1975, he has all of those again. And maybe that's the true heart of this story, that even in death, even in silence, truth waits. And sometimes, even after decades in the dark, truth speaks. So if you're watching this and you have a loved one who disappeared, keep pushing. If you're wondering what happened to a brother, a father, a daughter, a friend, don't give up. Because stories like Gerald's prove that silence is not the end. That a voice can echo back after 50 years. That sometimes, no matter how long it takes, the truth will come out. If this story moved you, if it gave you chills, made you think, or reminded you of someone who still hasn't come home, don't let it end here. Like this video so more people see Gerald's story. Subscribe to this channel to help uncover more unsolved mysteries and miraculous identifications. Share this story. You never know who might have a clue that could bring another soul home. Comment below. Do you think Gerald was murdered? Should the case be reopened for investigation? Together we keep these stories alive. Together we bring the missing back into the light.